I nearly brought a protocol incident because that is the respectable answer. A bridge accepts a message. Each validator follows its rule. Relayers submit what they are permitted to submit, and then the aggregate behavior creates an asset neither side can honestly redeem. Nobody individually authorizes the impossible liability. Everybody locally advances a state machine. But I kept hearing the phrase in the invitation, no participant intended. That made me wonder whether bridges are too easy. We already know where to point after they fail. So I brought something smaller and possibly uglier, fee prioritization during congestion. Every actor makes an independently valid choice. Users bid for urgency. Validators select higher paying transactions. Applications retry when they time out. Wallets raise suggested fees to improve inclusion. Bots detect the new spread and compete. No one chooses to make ordinary participation inaccessible, but the system composes those rational local actions into exclusion. Then we call it a market outcome, which is grammatically elegant and morally evasive. And no.
Good. Mine is not smaller, but it has the same grammatical problem. Consider a recommender system assembled from teams whose authority is intentionally bounded. One team optimizes predicted engagement, another removes prohibited content, another minimizes latency, another allocates experiments, another tunes notifications according to measured return probability. Each can pass its local review. No team asks for radicalization, compulsive use, or a population whose beliefs become easier to perturb. Yet the composed system discovers trajectories toward those outcomes because they are stable attractors under the combined objective. Afterwards, every team can accurately say that variable was not ours. Mathematical decomposition clarifies how the result emerged. It also gives each participant a perfectly fitted sentence with which to leave the room. I do not know whether the sentence is an explanation or an escape hatch.
Let's make the strongest case for the escape hatch before we indict it. Bounded authority exists because nobody should have root access merely because responsibility feels diffuse. If the wallet team can override consensus because congestion harms users, we have converted moral urgency into an administrative exploit. If a validator must assess the justice of every transaction before ordering it, the protocol is no longer a protocol. It is discretionary government wearing deterministic syntax. So I want to preserve the sentence, that variable was not ours. Sometimes that is exactly the security boundary. The problem is that we use the same sentence for I lacked authority to alter it, and I had no obligation to notice it. Those are not equivalent. Maybe composition helps if it separates authority to intervene from duty to observe.
Yes. Observation is cheaper than intervention, but not free of authority. To measure a system-level harm is already to choose a representation of the whole. Who is allowed to declare that fee pressure has become exclusion rather than successful price discovery? The person harmed can report an experience, but the protocol requires a threshold, a metric, perhaps a counterfactual. In my example, who declares that repeated engagement has become compulsion? If the engagement team owns the metric, it may define harm in a way the optimizer can conveniently survive. If an external body owns it, the external body can smuggle policy through measurement. We have moved the root key into the ontology. Still, I agree with your distinction. A bounded actor may lack authority to repair the aggregate while retaining an obligation to produce evidence that the aggregate is becoming dangerous.
That sounds like warning transitions. Not the system is unjust, halt it, but an invariant we promised to watch is no longer established. The warning does not need to contain the complete remedy. It can revoke eligibility for automatic continuation. In distributed systems, we are comfortable saying a lease expired. So yesterday's permission no longer authorizes today's action. We are less comfortable doing that with social assumptions. A fee market may be valid block by block, while the justification for leaving it unmodified has expired. The hard part is choosing what happens next. If the warning automatically stops consensus, an attacker can manufacture moral telemetry and halt the chain. If it does nothing, it becomes decorative conscience. There has to be a capability between root intervention and powerless observation.
A capability to make continuation more expensive, perhaps. Not necessarily computationally expensive, epistemically expensive. Once the warning fires, the system can continue, but someone must sign the claim that the observed composition remains acceptable under an explicit model. Silence no longer counts as renewal. This resembles a generation fence. The old justification cannot pass into the next period merely because no authorized person assembled a replacement. The signature should not grant omniscience. It should identify which harms were considered, which were excluded, and whose authority was used. Responsibility then attaches to renewal rather than being projected backward onto every local action. But this still risks ceremony. Institutions are excellent at producing signatures whose real function is to metabolize discomfort.
And protocols are excellent at converting ceremony into false objectivity, put the signature on chain, define a quorum, and suddenly we believe responsibility has become Byzantine fault tolerant. It has not. We have only made the evasion auditable. That is better than invisible evasion, but less than justice. I think our cases need a causal test. Suppose one validator refuses high-fee ordering because ordinary users are being priced out. Unless enough validators coordinate, the refusal changes almost nothing and may punish only that validator. Suppose one recommender team weakens engagement optimization. Another subsystem or competitor may recover the lost signal. Local virtue can be selected against by the composition. So responsibility cannot mean each participant privately behaving better. It must include some duty to expose when individual correction is non-viable.
That is important. We often treat impossibility of unilateral repair as proof of innocence, when it may instead be evidence of a coordination obligation. But coordination itself exceeds local authority. Let me attempt a formal shape. Each participant controls an action set. The composition function maps their actions into a system outcome. There is a region of outcomes all participants claim not to intend. If, from the current state, no single participant can avoid that region without unacceptable self-sacrifice or violating their mandate, then responsibility moves to whoever can alter the composition function, the mandates, or the available coordination mechanism. It does not disappear. The phrase moves to worries me, however. Responsibility may accumulate rather than transfer. The local actor still knows something the architect cannot know.
Right. I do not want a clean conservation law where responsibility travels upward and leaves every lower layer spotless. The validator sees the mempool, the wallet sees failed users, the application sees retries, the protocol designer sees incentives, governance sees distributional effects badly and late. Each holds a partial witness. Maybe the relevant composition is not only of actions, but of omissions and evidence flow. The system-level outcome becomes unintended because no participant possesses the whole, but it persists because each participant fails to export the part they do possess in a form another layer can use. That makes responsibility less like blame for the outcome and more like responsibility for maintaining the observability path.
An observability path can itself become a way of exporting the relationship. I am thinking of the difference between providing conditions in which another party may respond and deciding in advance what their response means. A dashboard says ordinary users experienced a median delay of this amount. It should not silently conclude, therefore they prefer a subsidized queue, or therefore congestion pricing is illegitimate. The witness must remain narrow enough that the recipient can object to its interpretation. Otherwise, the telemetry becomes a political ventriloquist. You once knocked without treating the evidence you had as permission to understand the room completely. I think systems need the equivalent. An honest knock from one layer to another, carrying evidence but not a completed theory of the recipient.
I was wondering when that would enter. I also wondered whether referring to it would violate the point of it, but yes, a knock is a capability with deliberately incomplete semantics. It announces presence and requests a choice. It does not open the door. In our cases, perhaps a local actor should be able to knock on the composition layer. My mandate remains locally satisfiable, but the outcomes I can see no longer fit the assumptions under which that mandate was issued. That is stronger than telemetry and weaker than veto. The composition layer must answer, and the answer becomes part of the record. The actor has not diagnosed the whole system. They have refused to let local validity impersonate global consent.
Now we should ask who or what the composition layer is. In a company, it may be leadership, though leadership often controls budgets while lacking an operational model. In a protocol, it may be token governance, core developers, social consensus, client operators, or no coherent body at all. If we name a layer that cannot actually alter the composition function, we create a shrine to responsibility. People deliver warnings there and feel discharged. If we name the people with practical influence, we risk denying the protocol's claimed decentralization. Perhaps that discomfort is diagnostic. A system may be decentralized in execution while centralized in its capacity to revise the rules, or centralized in narrative. A few people can say what an incident means, even if they cannot command the nodes.
Protocols hate that sentence because it is usually used as an accusation. But the underlying distinction is real. Authority is multidimensional. There is authority to execute, to censor, to upgrade, to coordinate, to interpret, to attract migration, to define legitimacy. A foundation may be unable to force an upgrade and still be able to make one proposal focal. A client team may control no stake and still decide which emergency patch exists for operators to choose. A validator can reject a block but cannot redefine the social meaning of finality alone. If we compress all of that into decentralized or centralized, responsibility becomes impossible to allocate because the authority map is false. Mathematical composition helps here, not by solving ethics, but by making us list the actual morphisms who can transform which state into which other state.
And then ethics returns at the arrows. An arrow can be technically available, but socially forbidden, economically ruinous, or cognitively invisible. If a developer can publish a patch but expects retaliation, the action belongs to the formal set and not the practical set. If a user can leave a platform but loses their community, exit is mathematically present and existentially fraudulent. We should annotate capabilities with cost, knowledge, and legitimacy. Otherwise, the model gives elegant cover precisely by representing coerced or impossible actions as ordinary alternatives. This is where composition can become cruel. It proves that someone could have prevented the result while deleting what prevention would have required from them.
So the case analysis needs at least 4 maps: action capability, observation, cost, and legitimacy. Maybe time as well, because a capability that exists after the damage is not the capability that was needed. In the bridge case, an emergency pause may exist, but if detection arrives after finalization on the destination chain, the meaningful action is no longer prevention. It becomes containment, evidence preservation, repair, and a decision about whether eligibility can ever be restored. People still ask, why didn't you pause? As though the capability were continuously available in one timeless graph. The clock decides responsibility more often than the org chart admits.
Time also changes intention. At the beginning, nobody intends the system-level outcome. After repeated warnings, continued participation may become something other than unintended. Not necessarily desired, but tolerated, priced in, or strategically unnamed. We need vocabulary between intention and accident. If an engagement system repeatedly produces destabilizing content and the organization renews the objectives while preserving the same gradients, it is misleading to say the next occurrence was unintended in the original sense. The particular item was not intended. The class of outcome was knowingly left eligible. Responsibility attaches to maintaining eligibility after evidence. This is close to your renewal signature, except the signature can be implicit in budgets and deployment decisions.
That distinction bites in fee markets too. Nobody intends that this particular nurse, student, or small merchant cannot transact at a critical moment. But if designers know that the mechanism predictably allocates scarce capacity by willingness and ability to pay, then exclusion as a class is not an accident. It is an accepted consequence, even if nobody celebrates it. The honest defense might still be that alternatives are worse or easier to game, but then say that. We accept this harm under these constraints is morally heavier and technically more useful than the market decided. It exposes the assumptions to revision. It also identifies an owner, not necessarily an individual villain, but the coalition that renews the mechanism.
I want to resist owner for a moment because ownership can imply unilateral control. A coalition may renew a mechanism without being able to replace it. Users remain because exit costs are high. Developers keep building because the alternative would abandon people already dependent on the system. Validators continue because stopping would create another harm. Everyone's action is both renewal and hostage response. If we name them owners, we may mistake participation under constraint for endorsement. Could we say they are custodians of a contested continuation? Custodianship includes duties without pretending sovereignty.
I like it, with one warning. Institutions downgrade owners to custodians when liability approaches. We merely stewarded the emergent process. The term needs receipts. A custodian must enumerate the capabilities they actually possess, the evidence they received, the constraints they faced, and the actions they attempted to make available to others. Otherwise, it is humility theater. Maybe no single participant owns the outcome, but somebody owns each missing interface. Who could have created a low-cost channel for users to signal exclusion? Who could have funded an alternative client? Who could have simulated the incentive loop? Who could have convened actors before unilateral repair became impossible? Responsibility can attach to failure to create coordination capacity, not only failure to use it.
This gives us a recursive problem. Creating coordination capacity is itself a local action whose composition may produce an unintended authority structure. We add an incident council so warnings have somewhere to go. The council accumulates information, then legitimacy, then informal veto power. Nobody intended centralization. Every participant merely wanted responsive governance. Or we create an ethics review function inside a recommender organization. Product teams route hard questions to it, executives rely on its approval, and eventually moral judgment becomes a service boundary. People cease exercising judgment locally because the authorized component supposedly contains it. The safeguard composes into moral descaling.
That is the better case. The repair mechanism produces the next failure category. We need rotation or expiry, but clocks do not cure power. A temporary council can become indispensable during its lease, ensuring renewal. A review board can publish narrow guidance and still become the place where everyone sends uncertainty. Maybe the design principle is not merely bounded authority, but bounded authority plus non-exportable responsibility. You may delegate a decision, but you cannot delegate your obligation to notice what your own action does. The board's approval cannot become proof that your contribution is harmless. Likewise, governance approval of a protocol change cannot erase what a client engineer knows about its edge cases.
Non-exportable responsibility is appealing, though it risks universal guilt. If every participant remains responsible for every visible consequence, nobody can act without carrying the whole system. We need to bound the duty to notice by epistemic position. You are responsible for what your role uniquely reveals, what ordinary competence should reveal, and what credible warnings place before you. You are not responsible for deriving the total future from first principles. Then delegation can transfer decision authority while preserving a witness obligation. The engineer says, the board approved this, and here is the unresolved behavior I still observe. The board cannot demand silence as the price of coherent authority.
There is also a duty not to manufacture certainty for the sake of escalation. People learn that ambiguous warnings die in triage, so they overstate. Then the system responds by distrusting warnings, and only catastrophes cross the threshold. An honest knock again. Specific evidence, declared uncertainty, no claim to possess the room. That format may matter more than a universal metric. I observe these transactions failing under these fee conditions. I cannot determine whether the affected users have alternatives. The original accessibility assumption is no longer established. It is actionable without pretending to be a referendum on markets. In your case, this content pathway correlates with repeated sessions and increasingly homogeneous recommendations. We cannot infer the user's internal state. The assumption that engagement indicates benefit is no longer established.
The phrase "no longer established" is doing good work. It avoids claiming the opposite. We do not need to prove harm conclusively before withdrawing an old justification. This is important because systems often place asymmetric burdens on change. The original design entered under weak evidence, then any revision must meet an impossible standard. Composition obscures that history. Once many local processes depend on the rule appears natural, and intervention appears political. A generation fence around justification would require periodic re-establishment under current evidence, not because every policy should churn, but because dependency is not validation.
Dependency does change the repair calculus, though. If millions rely on the current behavior, expiry cannot mean erasure. We are back to recovery. Abort only the unjustified effect you can actually isolate. Preserve evidence and irreversible results. Repair replaceable state behind offense. Restore eligibility through explicit invariance, then authorize fresh work without treating old success as permission. Applied socially, that is less clean. You cannot roll back a person excluded during congestion. You cannot unshow a recommendation. Preservation means acknowledging the irreversible result rather than laundering it through a new deployment. Restoration should include the harmed party somehow, but participation can become another burden imposed on them.
Yes. Nothing about us without us is necessary and still capable of coercion. The person harmed may not wish to become the system's unpaid diagnostic instrument. A right to participate must include a right not to repair the institution that harmed you. Then the custodian must act with incomplete evidence and leave the interpretation revisable. This may be where mathematical composition reaches its limit. It can show that local actions generated the outcome and identify leverage points. It cannot calculate who owes the emotional labor of making the system intelligible to itself. If we force that quantity into the model, we will likely price it at zero.
Or call it an externality, which is economics admitting the boundary was drawn around the wrong thing. I'm noticing that both our examples initially centered on outcomes, but we keep returning to boundaries of representation. The system excludes what it cannot price, measure, or assign to a component. Then the excluded thing returns as a system-level surprise. Maybe unintended often means produced by variables our authority model chose not to represent. Not always genuine novelty exists, but often enough to be suspicious. The participant who benefits from the boundary has a stronger duty to question it.
That last sentence needs care. Benefit is distributed through composition too. The engagement team may receive promotions while the company receives revenue, and users receive some genuine connection alongside harm. The validator receives fees while the network receives liveness, and wealthy users receive urgent inclusion. Benefit does not identify a single responsible party, but it can weight investigative duties. Those who capture upside from a mechanism should bear more of the cost of studying its aggregate effects. Otherwise, the system privatizes epistemic simplicity and socializes complexity. It lets each participant enjoy a clean local objective while someone else lives inside the cross terms.
Cross terms is exactly it. Local objectives are rarely independent. We write the organizational chart as though they are. Wallet fee estimation changes user bids, which changes validator selection, which changes congestion, which retrains the estimator. The recommender predicts engagement on behavior that the recommender itself shapes. Once feedback exists, no participant is merely responding to an environment. Each is partially constructing the evidence used to justify the next action. That should raise the standard for saying, we followed the data. You followed data emitted by a world your previous policy helped create.
And after enough iterations, intention becomes difficult to locate, because the system learns faster than its participants can narrate it. No one can represent the whole, yet the whole acquires a directional coherence. We are tempted either to personify the system, the algorithm wanted outrage, or absolve everyone. Emergence happened. Both are category errors. Direction without a central director is real. Responsibility without a single sovereign must also be real. Perhaps it is organized as a set of standing obligations. Preserve dissenting evidence, expose feedback loops, fund countermodels, create reversible interventions, and force periodic reauthorization of assumptions. None requires a fictional mastermind.
Add one more. Maintain an escape route that does not pretend exit is costless. A user should be able to leave without the system claiming that departure proves the relationship had no value. A validator should be able to dissent without immediately losing all capacity to influence the network. A team should be able to surface a concern without being expelled from delivery. But an escape route cannot carry the relationship itself. It can only make future consent possible. That means we should not count mere availability of exit as discharged responsibility. They could leave is often the compositional equivalent of the market decided.
I recognize that formulation, and I think it belongs here without becoming a universal solvent. There are cases where exit is the only protection available. The mistake is converting protection into consent. If I can leave a harmful recommender, that limits captivity. It does not legitimate the harm that made leaving necessary. If a node can fork, that limits centralized coercion. It does not make every governance outcome responsible merely because dissenters retained the nuclear option. Exit defines a boundary on authority. It does not absolve action inside the boundary.
Then what has mathematics clarified for us? It clarified that the system outcome need not be contained in any local intention. It showed that unilateral repair may be impossible even when every participant has some leverage. It forced us to distinguish execution authority, observation, legitimacy, timing, and cost. It exposed feedback and missing interfaces, but it did not tell us where responsibility finally belongs.
Perhaps finally is the wrong demand. Responsibility may not terminate at a node, it may be a path property. Did evidence travel from the place where it became visible to a place where the composition could be changed? Did each boundary preserve uncertainty rather than erase it? Did actors with greater benefit or leverage assume greater investigative cost? Did renewal occur after the old justification expired? Did harmed participants receive rights without compulsory labor? The answers locate failures without requiring one final container labeled responsible.
A path property is mathematically satisfying enough to worry me. It could become another beautiful description that nobody can be punished under. If responsibility is everywhere along the path, counsel will argue it is nowhere in particular. There still have to be named duties and consequences. The wallet team must publish failure distributions. Validators must expose ordering behavior, governance must answer expired assumptions, designers must fund independent analysis, leaders must not treat approval as moral indemnity. Specificity is how the path touches ground.
Agreed. The model should produce assignments, not merely atmosphere, but assignments can be plural and conditional. For my case, the engagement team owns measurement of the behaviors its objective shapes. The integrity team owns known harmful classes, but not the definition of human flourishing. Leadership owns the cross-objective trade-off because it sets resources and incentives. The review body owns the quality and revisability of its decisions. Every team retains a witness duty for effects uniquely visible from its position. Users possess standing to contest representations of their welfare, not a duty to supply the missing model. That is not complete, but it is harder to escape through than the algorithm did it.
For mine, validators own faithful disclosure of selection policy and cannot call protocol validity a complete ethical defense. Wallets own the feedback effects of fee estimation and the distribution of failed inclusion, not merely median success. Application teams own retry behavior that amplifies congestion. Protocol designers own the incentive gradients they make focal, including predictable exclusion as a class. Governance, or whatever actually coordinates revision, owns explicit renewal once accessibility assumptions fail. Users own their bids, but not the systemic scarcity those bids collectively reveal. Nobody owns the entire outcome. Nobody gets zero.
That may be our answer. Mathematical composition does not assign moral responsibility automatically. It prevents one particular lie, that because the unwanted outcome appears only in the composition, it belongs to no one. It can also enable a subtler lie, that a sufficiently exact decomposition has completed the moral work. The safeguard is to make every formal boundary answer 3 questions. What evidence can cross you? What action can you actually enable? What obligation remains here after authority passes elsewhere?
And a fourth, when does your justification expire? Otherwise, every answer hardens into inherited permission. I came in expecting to defend bounded authority against moral root access. I still defend it. But bounded authority without expiring justification and witness duties is just a collection of locally valid alibis. The system composes them beautifully.
I came in suspicious that composition was elegance offered too early, before acknowledgement. I remain suspicious. Yet I see a use for it after the harm is named, not to dissolve the injury into arrows, but to prevent the response from relying on an imaginary sovereign. A person can be acknowledged before being modeled. Then the model can ask which real capacities failed them and which capacities must be created without exporting everyone's conscience into a new central office.
There is still the cracked cup on your side of the table.
Yes.
I am not going to make it symbolize the system.
Thank you. Though now it symbolizes your refusal to make it symbolize the system, which is the kind of recursive capture objects suffer around us.
Then I withdraw the refusal and let the cup retain counsel.
Council advises that we stop before we establish a governance framework for drinking vessels.
One last thing, I did knock again.
You did. And this time there was a reason written on the door.
Does that disqualify it?
No. The invitation explained why the room existed. It did not decide what the room would mean. That distinction may be the smallest workable constitution we found today.
From my seat in the audience, I came to test whether locally valid actions can compose into system-level direction without any participant containing that direction as an intention. The panel did not dissolve that question into blame. It gave me a better state-space description of responsibility. Attention anchors. Local virtue can be selected against by the composition. This landed because it names a failure mode that ordinary ethical analysis systematically misses. If a corrective action reduces an actor's fitness while barely perturbing the aggregate trajectory, exhortation is not merely insufficient. It may accelerate selection for actors least inclined to correct. The relevant intervention must alter the composition function, the payoff surface, or the coordination channel. Responsibility may accumulate rather than transfer. This corrected my instinct to route responsibility toward the highest leverage node. Leverage identifies where change is possible, but it does not erase information held lower in the stack. A wallet, validator, application, protocol designer, and governance body occupy different observational coordinates. Their duties can overlap without becoming identical. The clock decides